The silence in the chapel was almost unbearable. Only the soft rustling of black clothing and muffled sobs filled the air. The scent of white lies mingled with the heavy weight of grief. Everyone had gathered to bid farewell to a hero. In the center of the aisle, beneath the stained glass windows that cast a pale morning light, rested a dark oak casket. A neatly folded flag lay on top, a symbol of duty and sacrifice. Yet for those who knew Elijah Calloway, it all felt unjust. He had survived explosions, ambushes, and freezing desert nights, only to end up here, lifeless, cold, without a final goodbye. His comrades stood in formation, their faces stiff, jaws clenched. None of them dared to break ranks, but their eyes betrayed their pain. In the front pew sat a woman with pinned-up brown hair, clutching a damp tissue between trembling fingers. Margaret, Elijah's sister, was the picture of grief. But no one in that room felt the loss more deeply than Orion, the German shepherd standing at the entrance of the chapel. His leash was held by an officer, but his chest rose and fell rapidly, as if he knew something was wrong. His deep brown eyes scanned the room for a sign, an answer. When his gaze landed on the casket, something in him shifted. Without warning, Orion did something no one expected. With a sudden, desperate jerk, he broke free from the officer's grip. His nails clicked on the polished floor as he sprinted down the aisle before anyone could stop him. A startled gasp echoed through the chapel as he leaped into the casket. The flag swayed slightly from the impact, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed as though Elijah might wake up. Orion curled up on his partner's chest, sniffing desperately, as if waiting for a response. A soft, mournful whimper escaped his throat, heavy with despair and sorrow. Then he laid his head on Elijah's shoulder and closed his eyes. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. The chapel was engulfed in oppressive silence. No one dared to breathe. Orion lay still on Elijah's body, his head nestled against the soldier's shoulder as if trying to wake him. His ears twitched at the faint echoes of muffled sobs. He had been trained for war, for danger, for obedience, but nothing had prepared him for losing his partner. A muffled cry broke the silence. Margaret clung to the pew as if it were the only thing holding her up. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from hours of crying. Around her, the rows of soldiers sat motionless, their uniforms immaculate, their hands tightly clasped. They had fought by Elijah's side, seen him go through hell and back, but nothing had prepared them for this sight. An officer stepped forward cautiously and reached for Orion's collar, but the dog let out a deep, warning growl. It wasn't aggressive. It was protective, desperate. His paws dug into the fabric of Elijah's uniform, as if clinging to the man who had been his entire world. The officer hesitated, then slowly withdrew his hand. "Let him be," said Captain Reynolds quietly, though his voice carried the weight of finality. "He's grieving, just like the rest of us." Margaret wiped her tears with trembling fingers. Her voice was barely a whisper. "He doesn't understand. He thinks Elijah will come back." The words hung suffocatingly in the air. Orion let out a soft whine and nudged Elijah's arm with his nose, just as he would on the battlefield when his handler was down. It was a signal. "Get up, soldier!" But there was no response. Then Orion's body stiffened suddenly. His ears perked up. His breathing grew shallow. He lifted his head slightly and fixed his gaze on something in the distance, something no one else could see. A shiver ran through the room, almost imperceptible, but enough to make the hairs on Margaret's neck stand on end. Orion wasn't just looking, he was tracking something. Margaret swallowed hard, glanced at the chaplain, and then back at Orion. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Orion didn't respond. He didn't move. He simply stared. A cold silence settled over the chapel. The atmosphere shifted. Grief still hung heavy in the air, but now something else crept in, something unnamed. Sergeant Carter, who had served with Elijah, cleared his throat. "What's he seeing?" His voice was hoarse, filled with something between fear and awe. No one answered. The silence stretched. Orion didn't blink. His breathing remained steady but focused, as if tracking a presence no one else could perceive. Then, without warning, he let out a soft whimper. Not the mournful cry from before, but something else. A subtle question. His tail wagged faintly, His ears twitched as if listening to something faint and distant. Then he relaxed, not completely, but enough for those closest to him to notice. Margaret's throat tightened. "Orion," she whispered, taking a hesitant step forward. But Orion didn't respond. He was somewhere else, a place beyond death itself. Orion remained fixed in his stare, as if locked onto a target only he could see. The air in the chapel was heavy, almost tangible. Margaret barely dared to breathe. She could see the sorrow in Orion's posture, but there was something else too, a tense anticipation. "Orion," she whispered again, but the dog didn't move. The chaplain glanced at the silent soldiers, then at Orion. His voice was soft, but everyone could hear it. "Dogs see what we cannot." A faint shiver ran through the ranks. Some soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. Orion seemed to be listening to something beyond their understanding. Margaret followed his gaze, but there was nothing, just the casket, the flag, the flickering candlelight. Her pulse quickened. Then Orion blinked and exhaled deeply, his body visibly relaxed. His eyes lingered on Elijah's face one last time before he lowered his head onto his fallen partner's chest. The chapel remained somber, but the eerie tension had lifted. Margaret wiped her eyes, her fingers burying themselves in Orion's fur. He didn't flinch. Whatever he had seen, if he had seen anything at all, was gone now. The chaplain cleared his throat and straightened. "We gather not only to honor Sergeant Elijah's service, but also to remember the man he was, brave, loyal, and above all, selfless." He paused, his gaze drifting to the folded flag on the casket. "He gave his life for others, not because he had to, but because he wanted to." The soldiers remained disciplined, but their eyes betrayed how deeply the words struck them. The clicking of boots echoed as the honor guard stepped forward to fold the flag. Every movement was precise, practiced, yet today it felt different. Elijah wasn't just another fallen soldier, he was their brother. As the flag was folded, Orion let out a soft whimper, barely audible but echoing through the room like a ripple of pain. Margaret inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her dress. An officer knelt before her and handed her the flag. His voice was firm but gentle. "On behalf of the President of the United States, the U.S. Army, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for the honorable and faithful service of your beloved brother." Margaret took the flag with trembling hands and pressed it to her chest. It was heavy, not in weight, but in meaning, a final gift, a final goodbye. Then the first shot rang out. The 21-gun salute shattered the silence, cutting through the air like a heartbeat. Margaret flinched with each shot. Orion didn't move. He remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the casket. Then came the sound that shook everyone, a single mournful note. The bugle began to play. Taps, the melody slow and filled with sorrow, settling into the hearts of all present. Orion lowered his head, his ears drooping slightly. His body, once tense, seemed to soften with the fading of the final notes. There was no more resistance, no more hope, only acceptance. As the last echo faded, Orion slowly stood, stepped forward, and pressed himself close to the casket. Then he let out a deep, heavy sigh, not of grief, but of farewell. The chapel remained silent. No one moved. Even the wind outside had stilled, as if the world had paused for a moment. Orion stood quietly beside the casket, his breathing steady, but his eyes told a different story. He had been trained for combat, for protection, for obedience, but nothing had prepared him for no longer receiving commands. Margaret sat motionless, the flag pressed tightly to her chest. Her brother was truly gone. There was no going back, no reunion. Sergeant Carter stepped forward. "We should take Orion outside." Margaret looked at Orion. He hadn't moved since the last note of taps. He lay still beside Elijah's casket. She reached out slowly, her fingers gently touching his fur. "Orion," she whispered. The dog didn't respond. Carter knelt beside him. "Come on, buddy, it's time to go." Orion finally moved, but it wasn't an act of obedience. It was a decision, a slow, deliberate farewell. He lifted his head, glanced at the casket one last time, and then stepped back. The heavy chapel doors opened slowly, and a cool breeze swept through the room. Orion remained motionless beside the casket, his gaze fixed on Elijah's resting body, as if he still couldn't accept the reality. Margaret stood hesitantly, the folded flag in her arms feeling heavier with each passing second. She swallowed the lump in her throat and turned to Orion. "Come on, boy," she whispered softly, running her fingers through his fur. Orion didn't respond immediately. Only when Sergeant Carter approached and gave him a respectful nod did Orion slowly move. With one last glance at the casket, he finally stood and followed Margaret at a measured pace. Outside, the sky was gray, and a light wind rustled through the treetops. The soldiers flanking the procession stood at attention, their faces expressionless. Margaret walked with Orion at her side along the paved path leading to the cemetery. The hearse was already waiting. The soldiers took their positions, their movements filled with reverence. Orion stopped abruptly, his ears twitching, his head turning slightly as if he had heard something. Margaret noticed and frowned. "What is it?" she whispered. But there was nothing, just the chapel, the windy sky, and the slowly gathering procession. Orion paused for a moment longer, then continued on his way. The casket was carefully loaded into the hearse. Orion sat at the edge of the vehicle, watching every movement with intense focus. He wasn't restless. He was vigilant, as if he still had one last duty to fulfill. The drive to the cemetery was silent. Margaret held the flag tightly to her chest while Orion lay motionless on the floor, his breathing calm but his eyes alert. Everyone knew this was a farewell no one was ready to accept. At the cemetery, everything was prepared. The casket was slowly carried from the hearse to the gravesite. Orion walked with his head lowered at Margaret's side, his steps heavy but deliberate. The chaplain stepped forward. Sergeant Elijah Calloway dedicated his life to serving his country, his comrades, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his canine partner. His gaze fell on Orion. Even now, that bond is still felt. Margaret felt her throat tighten. The soldiers stood in silent formation. Carter clasped his hands in front of his chest, his eyes on the casket. Orion stepped forward. He stood directly in front of the casket and gently lowered his nose, as if committing the scent to memory. Then he slowly raised a paw and placed it on the wood, a gesture of farewell, filled with reverence and pain. The onlookers held their breath. Even the most disciplined soldiers couldn't hide the moisture in their eyes. Margaret bit her lip to suppress a sob. Carter took a deep breath and briefly looked away. Then Orion lowered his paw, sat back down, and remained motionless. He had said his goodbye. The chaplain continued, his voice now softer. "They say love endures beyond death. Perhaps it's true." His eyes rested on Orion for a moment. A soldier stepped forward and handed Margaret a small wooden box. "This belonged to Elijah," he said quietly. Margaret took the box carefully and opened it. Inside was Elijah's dog tag, along with a faded photo of him and Orion. She bit her lip and closed the box with trembling fingers. The ceremony neared its end. A soft breeze made the leaves rustle as the soldiers formed up. Then the casket began to be lowered. Orion stood motionless, his ears perked, his posture attentive. Margaret stepped to the edge of the grave, her fingers tightening around the flag as she looked down at the polished surface of the casket one last time. Her heart ached, but she knew she had to let go. Finally, Orion moved. With slow steps, he approached and leaned forward, his nose gently touching the wood as if feeling Elijah one last time. Then he sat beside Margaret and lowered his head. The soldiers stood at attention for a silent farewell. The chaplain recited the final prayer, and as it ended, Margaret let a handful of soil fall into the grave. Orion watched her, then did the same. With a gentle motion of his paw, he let a bit of earth trickle down, a final sign of parting. The silence after the ceremony was overwhelming. No one spoke. Margaret took a deep breath and looked down at Orion. "Come on, boy," she said softly. Orion lifted his head, hesitated for a moment, then followed her. Together they left the cemetery as the wind whispered through the trees. Margaret and Orion left the cemetery in silence. The sun was beginning to set, casting the landscape in warm light and letting long shadows dance over the graves. Orion trotted close to Margaret's side, his head lowered, his ears slightly back. He looked exhausted, but not just physically. It was as if the grief had weighed on him as heavily as it had on everyone else. When they reached the car, Margaret opened the door and watched as Orion slowly jumped into the passenger seat. He curled up, but his gaze remained fixed on the cemetery, as if still standing watch. Margaret sighed softly, stroked his fur, and then got in herself. The drive home was quiet. Margaret held the folded flag in her lap, her thoughts circling around Elijah and all the memories they had shared. Beside her, Orion lay, his breathing calm but his body tense, as if waiting for Elijah to return at any moment. When they reached the house, Orion jumped out of the car and stood uncertainly for a moment, his gaze wandering to the window as if expecting Elijah to be waiting there. Margaret felt her throat tighten. "Come on, boy," she said softly, opening the door. Inside, everything was still. The rooms felt colder, emptier. Elijah's boots were still by the door, his jacket draped over a chair. Orion stood in the middle of the living room, sniffing the air as if searching for a trace that had long since faded. Margaret placed the flag on the table and sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. The reality was now unavoidable. Elijah would never walk through that door again. Suddenly, Orion lifted his head. His ears twitched, and his gaze fixed on a point in the air. Margaret looked at him. "What is it, boy?" Orion stood, moved slowly through the room, and stopped in front of Elijah's armchair. He sniffed carefully, then sat down. His posture changed. He no longer seemed as tense. His tail twitched slightly, and for a moment, it was as if he saw someone only he could perceive. A gentle shiver ran down Margaret's spine. She didn't want to be superstitious, but something about this moment felt different. Orion wagged his tail once, then lay down beside the chair and sighed deeply. It was as if he understood that Elijah was gone, but not truly gone. Night fell. Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to Orion's soft breathing at the foot of her bed. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Elijah, his smile, his warm eyes. Memories came in waves, painful and beautiful at the same time. Sometime in the night, Orion stood up. Margaret heard the soft clicking of his nails on the wooden floor. She turned and watched him in the faint moonlight. Orion walked toward the living room, as if called by something. Curious, Margaret followed him. Orion stopped in front of Elijah's armchair. He lifted his head, perked his ears, and stared into the darkness. Margaret shivered, not from fear, but from a strange sense of certainty. She sat down slowly on the floor, leaning against the chair, and placed a hand on Orion's back. "We miss him, don't we?" she whispered. Orion laid his head on her knees and sighed deeply. Margaret felt tears welling up, but this time, it wasn't just pain. It was also peace. She knew Elijah wasn't truly gone, not as long as Orion could still sense him, not as long as she carried him in her heart. Outside, a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. The world moved on, but in that house, in that moment, Margaret knew that some bonds could never be broken, not even by death. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Thanks to our valued viewers, we continue to improve every day. Please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up.